Hi there, Dave here. Today I'm going to be talking about how to choose the right power supply for when you're building a computer. Now first you need to choose all of your other computer parts, then choose the power supply last. So let's work out how many watts your power supply will need. To work this out we can use a power supply calculator. If you Google this you'll find that there's many power supply calculators out there, but two of my favourites are called Extreme Power Supply Calculator Lite and Cooler Master Power Supply Calculator. I'll put the links to these below this video. Once you're there, put in all of your computer's components using the drop-down menus. Now if you think you might be adding a few extra parts to your computer sometime in the near future, then include those in the list as well. For example, if your computer build will have one hard drive for now, but you want to add another hard drive later on, then include that in the list. Once you've added everything to the list, click on Calculate. Whatever is recommended, make sure you get a power supply that can produce at least that amount of watts. It's okay to get a more powerful power supply than what's been recommended, but never get one that is less powerful than what's recommended. Now for the power supply's power connectors. This is an SATA power connector, which is used to power up most hard drives these days. This includes hard disk drives, hybrid drives and solid state drives. And they also power up most optical drives, including DVD drives and Blu-ray drives. This is a 4-pin peripheral power connector, sometimes referred to as a Molex power connector. This is sometimes used to power up old hard drives and old optical drives, and is sometimes used to power up case fans and older graphics cards. By the way, many case fans can be plugged into the motherboard instead of using one of these power connectors. And this is a floppy power connector. These can be used to power up old floppy disk drives, some internal card readers and various other components. And here we have a PCI Express power connector. This is used to power up graphics cards that need extra power. These come in two different varieties, a 6-pin and an 8-pin. If you have an 8-pin PCI Express power connector, like this one, you can normally separate 2 pins away from the rest of them. So you can use power connectors like these as a 6-pin or an 8-pin PCI Express power connector to power up a graphics card. Some graphics cards don't need these power connectors as they get all the power they need from the motherboard, but many of the more powerful graphics cards do need one or two of them. Now for the motherboard power connector. Most motherboards these days use a 24-pin power connector, but some motherboards, especially older ones, use a 20-pin power connector. Often these connectors will have 4 detachable pins, so that you can use it as a 20-pin or a 24-pin power connector to power up the motherboard. And finally, the processor power connector. Most processors need a 4-pin ATX 12V power connector or an 8-pin EPS 12V power connector to be plugged into the motherboard to power up the processor. You can look in your motherboard manual to see what you need to power up your processor. Some EPS 8-pin 12V power connectors like this one are described as 4+4-pin power connectors. This means that it can be used as an 8-pin EPS 12V power connector, or you can split it into 2 and use it as a 4-pin ATX 12V power connector instead. So just be sure the power supply that you're getting has all the power connectors that your new computer will need. So let's move on to the size of the power supply. By that I mean its physical dimensions. Make sure the power supply that you're getting is small enough that it will fit inside your computer case, as they do vary in size. Now with some power supplies, the fan won't start spinning until it reaches a certain temperature. In other words, the fan won't start spinning until it needs to. This is quite a handy feature if you want a quieter computer. So if you'd like one of those power supplies, look out for one of these that have a feature called 0 RPM fan mode or fanless mode or something along those lines. Okay, so some power supplies are described as modular and some are described as non-modular. Now, a modular power supply is like this one, where the cables are detachable from the power supply itself. Let's just plug that back in. And a non-modular power supply is one where all the cables are permanently attached to the power supply itself. Now, you do get semi-modular power supplies where only the most commonly used cables are permanently attached to the power supply and the rest are detachable. The advantage of having a modular power supply like this one is that any cables that you don't need for your computer, you can take them out and store them away, and that way they won't be cluttering up your computer case, so it'll look tidier, and also there'll be better airflow in your case as well with a modular power supply. The advantage of a non-modular power supply is that you don't have to figure out where each of these cables need to be plugged into on the power supply itself, although this is normally fairly obvious. And the other advantage is that you'll never lose any of these cables as they're permanently attached to it. Okay, now some power supplies will have one of these logos on them. Now this means that it will use power more efficiently and lose less power as heat. You'll also save some money on your electric bill as well. The most efficient of these power supplies is the 80 Plus titanium, and the least efficient is the 80 Plus, though the 80 Plus is still a lot better than getting a power supply with no rating at all. The good thing about getting one of these power supplies is that they'll save you money on your electric bill, they produce less heat, which means less fan noise, and they're likely to last you longer too. So are there any downsides to getting one of these power supplies? Well, the more efficient the power supply is, the more the power supply will cost you in the first place. So it's good to get a balance that's right for you. As for voltage, every power supply will have a voltage rating. So here in the UK we use 230 volts. So here we need a power supply that's rated at 230 volts. But other places will vary. So just make sure you get a power supply that has the right voltage rating for your country or area. Now, you may have noticed that some power supplies are advertised as having a single 12 volt rail, whilst others are advertised as having multiple 12 volt rails. So what does this actually mean? Well, this is a way to help protect your computer's components from getting too many amps. So for example, let's say we have a power supply that has a single 12 volt rail, and let's say that 12 volt rail will allow a maximum of 20 amps. Each computer component will pull whatever amount of amps it needs from the power supply. If the total of all the computer's components reaches above 20 amps in this case, the power supply will shut down to protect the computer's components. That is, if the power supply has overcurrent protection. Whereas most multi-12 volt rail power supplies will split up the 12 volt rail as shown here. For example, let's say we have a multi-12 volt rail power supply that can produce a maximum of 40 amps on the 12 volt rail. Both 12 volt rails might allow, for example, a maximum of 20 amps. So if, in this case, 20 amps is exceeded on either rail, the power supply will shut down to protect the computer's components. Again, only if the power supply has overcurrent protection. How multi-12 volt rails are split up among the computer's components will vary from one power supply to the next. For example, one power supply might give one 12 volt rail to the processor and the other to everything else, while another power supply might give one rail to a graphics card and the other to everything else, and so on. Some power supplies have more than two 12 volt power rails. By the way, the number of amps that will be allowed on each 12 volt rail will also vary from power supply to power supply. That goes for single 12 volt rail power supplies and multiple 12 volt rail power supplies as well. So that's the difference between a single and a multiple 12 volt rail power supply. Basically, they both have their own way of limiting the amount of amps the computer components can receive for safety reasons. It doesn't matter if you get a single or multiple 12 volt rail power supply. Just make sure your computer's components are getting the right amount of amps that they need. So how do you work out how many amps your computer components will need? Well, first off, every power supply will have a table to show you how many amps it can supply. This can be seen on the power supply itself, and you can find tables like these for many power supplies on the internet as well. The main thing we're concerned about here is the amps that can be produced on the 12 volt rail by the power supply. Now there's normally two things inside every computer that may require quite a lot of amps from the 12 volt rail from the power supply. That's the graphics card and the processor. Now let's suppose we're going to use this graphics card. This is a GTX 770 graphics card from NVIDIA, and that requires about 19 amps from the power supply's 12 volt rail. And let's suppose we're also going to use the Intel Core i7 4790K processor. Now that requires about 7 amps from the power supply's 12 volt rail. Now let's suppose we're going to use a computer like this that has a motherboard, 2 memory sticks, a DVD drive, 1 hard drive and 2 case fans, and let's suppose we also put in the graphics card and the processor that I mentioned into this computer. This computer would then require about 30 amps on the 12 volt rail from the power supply. Now on the graphics card's box, it recommends a power supply that can produce 42 amps on the 12 volt rail. So why is it recommending more amps than we actually need? Well, if it did have 42 amps on the 12 volt rail on the power supply, that would be enough for a computer like this with the graphics card and processor that I mentioned, and it would give us room for say a few extra hard drives, a few extra case fans and things like that. It's okay if the power supply can give out more amps than is needed on the 12 volt rail, just don't get one that puts out less amps than is needed. So that's a little bit of general information about amps on the 12 volt rail, just to give you an idea. But if you want to work out how many amps your computer will need on the 12 volt rail, and other rails as well, then I highly recommend Extreme Power Supply Calculator Pro. There's two versions of Extreme Power Supply Calculator. There's Extreme Power Supply Calculator Lite, which can be used for free to work out how many watts your computer build will need. Then there's Extreme Power Supply Calculator Pro, which will also tell you how many amps your computer will need. There is a small fee for the Pro version, but it's just as important to know how many amps your computer will need as it is to know how many watts your computer will need. Extreme Power Supply Calculator Pro makes it easy for you to discover how many amps your power supply will need to have on the 12 volt rail, the 5 volt and the 3.3 volt rail as well. By the way, I'm not being paid to advertise this is just what I recommend. Now when it comes to buying a power supply, my recommendation is don't go for a cheap power supply. There's a few reasons for this. The first is because they'll tell you how much power they can deliver, but this is normally only peak power. In other words, they can only deliver their stated amount of power for a short period of time. Whereas in most cases, power supplies from reputable brands can deliver around their stated amount of power continuously. Also, the cheaper power supplies are likely to last a shorter amount of time, and when they do malfunction, they're more likely to take out some of your other computer components as well. So get yourself a power supply from a reputable brand. That way you're much likely to have a good experience with it for many years to come. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. See you next time.